Top 20 Learning and Development Manager Interview Questions and Answers. A learning and development manager oversees the training and professional development of an organization's employees. The following 20 questions touch on key areas that are assessed when being interviewed for related roles. 1. Why are you interested in this role? This question is asked in all interviews. It is usually the first since it assesses your motives, which are important for the company. Tip number 1. Be careful when answering this. Tip number 2. Make sure that you link your personal skills to the job. Tip number 3. Convince the employer. Sample answer. I am passionate about service delivery and interaction with people. I have worked with several companies and dealt with diverse individuals. Therefore, I believe that I have the required skills for this position, which will help me further develop my people's and interpersonal skills. 2. What are the roles of a learning and development manager? Do you know what is expected of you? The interviewer wants to find out. Tip number 1. Precisely outline the roles of a leadership and development manager. Tip number 2. Ensure that you mention the roles that apply to the role in question. Sample answer. A learning and development manager is responsible for the training and development of employees. He or she identifies talents and strengths or weaknesses in an employee and helps him or her develop them. 3. What are the qualities of a learning and development manager? The interviewer is assessing if you know what it takes to be a successful learning and development manager. Tip number 1. Touch on the skills that are necessary for learning and development management. Tip number 2. Make sure that you answer this question confidently. Sample answer. A learning development manager should be a good communicator to pass around information easily. He or she should be a critical thinker and have decision-making skills. Other qualities include interpersonal skills and leadership skills, owing to the task at hand. 4. What major challenge did you face during your last role? How did you manage it? The interview is either testing your problem-solving skills or creativity. Therefore, make sure that you highlight any of these. Tip number 1. Talk about a real challenge. Tip number 2. Bring out how you overcame it. Sample answer. During my former working place, I had a problem training the employees effectively based on their huge number. I generally prefer lectures, which is not effective if you have a large audience. I decided to split the employees into groups and created a schedule. 5. Describe your daily routine as a learning and development manager. The interviewer wants to know how your normal day looks. There are several ways of going about this question. Tip number 1. Recite the typical day as a learning and development manager. Tip number 2. You can talk about your daily happenings in your former or current workplace. Sample answer. My daily routine as a learning and development manager is quite simple. I evaluate instructor performance and the effectiveness of training programs, develop staff development programs, conduct orientation sessions, and organize training manuals. 6. Briefly describe your experience. This is an easy question. The interviewer is giving you a chance to talk about your professional experience. Tip number 1. Mention some of the places you have previously worked in. Tip number 2. You can mention some of the places you interned if you do not have experience. Sample answer. I interned at General's War and Motors upon completing my undergraduate studies. I worked in the Human Resources Department and was later employed in the same company to be in charge of employee training. Shortly after leaving the company, I got a job with Wanderlust Motors, where I have been the learning and development manager for the last 5 years. 7. What kind of strategies and mindset is required for this job? Here, the interview assesses whether you understand what it takes to become a good learning and development manager. Tip number 1. Talk about a mindset that touches on the job at hand. Tip number 2. Have a good strategy, probably one that has worked for you. Sample answer. A good learning and development manager should have an accommodating mindset owing to the diverse workforce involved. He or she should be a positive thinker and a result-oriented person. The best strategy when dealing with several people is embracing teamwork. It is easier to work on projects when there is an adequate division of labor among peers. 8. What challenges do you foresee in this job? The interviewer wants to know whether you had conducted prior research and known more about your workplace role. Tip number 1. You can be honest. Tip number 2. If it is a problem that you can provide a solution to, make sure that you mention the solution. Sample answer. I have gone through the company's workforce record and discovered that you have employees from different walks of life. Therefore, the major challenge that I foresee in this job is trying to relate with employees personally. However, I am sure that I will still be able to get along with them. 9. What motivates you? The employer is simply trying to find out what keeps you interested in your work. Keep in mind that a motivated employee delivers. Tip number 1. Do not touch on monetary gains. Tip number 2. Link your motivation to the job at hand. Sample answer. I love coaching and learning from others. My job as a learning and development specialist allows me to meet several people from diverse backgrounds. Working every day and learning new things is my greatest motivation that has kept me going over time. 10. What is your greatest failure in life, and what did you learn from it? The interviewer wants to know whether you can learn from your mistakes and how they have shaped you. Tip number 1. Make sure that you talk of a personal experience. Tip number 2. Since the time frame has not been outlined, you can talk about any given time. Sample answer. I once got a supplementary exam while in college because I did not prioritize an art course over my engineering course. I realized that I should not take things lightly, a realization that has helped me throughout my career. 11. What is your biggest weakness as a learning and development manager? This is usually one of the toughest questions you can ever be asked in an interview. It needs a delicate balance that most people cannot manage. The interviewer may be asking it for many reasons. Tip number 1. You can talk about a weakness that is a strength in disguise. Tip number 2. Do not ruin your chances. Sample answer. Well, sometimes, I work too much that I fail to maintain a social life. I am usually fully engrossed in my work that I may even fail to notice things around me. 12. What did you like about your last job? This is as straightforward as it seems. The interviewer is trying to deduce some of the positive aspects that may have made your time at your previous employer worth it. Tip number 1. Do not focus on the negative. Tip number 2. Talk about some of the positive impacts that your previous job had. Sample answer. My last workplace had a conducive work environment. The employees were treated with respect, and everybody was free. It encouraged a lot of teamwork and exchange programs, which I found worthy. 13. What is your greatest professional achievement? We all know that employers are always looking for people with a track record. Employers want to know that. Tip number 1. You can use the STAR method when going about this. Tip number 2. Do not be shy to sell yourself. Sample answer. In my last workplace, I was charged with managing the invoicing process. It only took me 1 month to streamline the process, which had a huge impact on my group and company. I saved the group 10 hours of work every month and reduced errors on invoices by an incredible 30%. 14. How have you impacted your team in the past? The interviewer is testing your team working skills. Remember, this job entails a lot of teamwork, an area that must be assessed. Tip number 1. You can talk about an experience. Tip number 2. Make sure that you clearly define how you impacted your team. Sample answer. I would explain to my team and show them the best way possible out of a project. However, I was also willing to listen to them, and if they had a better way, I'd encourage them to let me know and try out if it could work or not. 15. What's your management style? Remember that this is a management position. Therefore, the interviewer is assessing your management skills to ascertain whether you are perfect for the position. Tip number 1. Show that your management style includes other employees. Tip number 2. Do not come off as proud. Sample answer. I always believe that the best way to help employees deliver to the best of their ability is by being a coach rather than a manager. This has always paid off over time. I once grew a team from 5 people to 10 and helped an underperforming employee become the best employee of the year. 16. Why do you think you are the best candidate for this position? Such questions are usually frequent but carry a lot of weight. You should answer this carefully by selling yourself. Tip number 1. You should show your worth. Tip number 2. You should not sound cocky or arrogant. Sample answer. I am a team worker who loves human interaction. I get along with all the employees in my areas of work and believe in employee motivation. I am also a hard worker who is result-oriented, and therefore, I believe that I am a perfect fit for this position. 17. What have you learned to improve your knowledge in this field? The interviewer wants to know how much you are committed to expanding your knowledge in this field. Remember that every employer wants a handy employee. Tip number 1. You can mention other activities that have helped you improve your knowledge. Tip number 2. Do not only restrict yourself to studying. Sample answer: I have attended several management seminars and met with some of the world's best learning and development managers. I am also a regular member of the Management Book Club, where we meet every Wednesday. 18. Do you like being around people? The interviewer is trying to assess whether you have people skills. Remember, your work will be all about interacting with different people. Tip number 1. Your answer should be affirmative. Tip number 2. Mention that you enjoy interacting and working with others. Sample answer: yes. I love being around people. I have been working with several people for a while now and learned great interpersonal skills. I also love working with others and derive great pleasure from helping people. This has also helped me become a great team player, which has further helped me advance in my career. 19. What have you done in your career to reduce costs, increase profits, or save time? The interviewer wants to know whether you will bring a valuable addition to the firm or not. Tip number 1. You are not limited to any time frame. Tip number 2. You can talk about any experience, however small. Sample answer: while working for Smith & Co., I streamlined a process that contributed to the reaping potential of the firm. The streamlining also ensured that workers could save time and reduce their overall monthly working time by a record of 10 hours. 20. How do you deal with conflict at your workplace? The interviewer is testing your conflict resolution skills. Conflict is often avoidable when people work together due to differences in goals and personal styles. Therefore, be careful when going about this question. Tip number 1. Clearly explain how to handle a conflict. Tip number 2. Touch on the key points. Sample answer: conflict handling is a skill that I have learned over time. When there is a conflict, the best thing to do is to talk to both parties and try to find out what the issue is. I also focus on the behavior and event and not on personalities. I listen carefully and identify points of agreement or conflict before developing a plan to work on each conflict. Conclusion: these 20 questions cover some of the commonest areas assessed during a learning and development manager interview. I hope that you will get a few tips on how to go about challenging questions during the interview.